Good morning and welcome to the IR interview series. I am Dr. Jon Oberg, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Global Political Studies at Malmö University, Sweden. In this interview series, we interview IR scholars about their preferred theoretical perspectives. The idea is to get a brief account of why scholars have come to appreciate a certain IR theory through a short interview. Today, I have the honor to interview a great and creative scholar. Welcome, Professor Tang Shiping.
Thank you, John, for having me. And it's great to be part of your wonderful experiment. And I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you very much. So before we start with the more specific questions about IR theory, could you please tell me about your scholarly background first?
Okay, so I was mostly trained as a natural scientist. I studied geology as an undergraduate, and I moved to molecular biology and genetics as a master's degree student, and then finally a PhD. So my PhD was in molecular biology and genetics. And only after that, I switched to international relations. So I only did an MA in international relations. So that partially explains my kind of particular way of doing theorization in IR, but also more broadly speaking, social science.
That's a very interesting background and quite different from many IR scholars, I would say.
Why?
Yeah. So where are you at the moment? Where are you working at the moment?
I'm now in Fudan University in Shanghai. So I came back from Singapore Nanyang Technological University to Fudan. That was 2009. So it's been like almost, well, more than 11 years.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, you are a creative scholar, as we know, and as you told us now, and you have been engaged in such a wide range of research. So not just political science and IR, but genetics, evolutionary biology, and on top of that, you have also developed a travel app, if I understand this
Hopefully
correctly.
you will be able to use it.
Yeah, so wow.
It's in China.
Yeah, travel app even. So despite all of this, I would still like to focus on IR and some of the key insights when it comes to Chinese IR. So what makes Chinese IR Chinese, and why is it important? And more specifically, have you been engaging in research that we could term Chinese IR?
I think the general background has always been more, whether China needs a particular IR theory or particular IR school. So I think there are really two voices for such a particular project. But let me first begin with by defining how can you define what is a Chinese IR per se, right? So there is a broader way of defining it, and that means any particular theory or approach developed by a Chinese scholar, like myself, will belong to the Chinese IR per se. So that's a very broad definition, and there's more kind of a narrowly defined definition, and that is you have to be able to draw specifics from Chinese philosophy, perhaps Chinese IR practice, etc., etc. So those are the two versions of Chinese IR. So if you prefer the first version, which is the broader one, so I can be considered as part of Chinese IR. But if you take a kind of narrower definition, then I may not be part of a Chinese IR. But for me, personally speaking, I don't really pay much attention to that because I think, as a scholar, you always want to at least contribute some kind of knowledge that may be universally applicable, or at least you have universal application or implications. So I would say most Chinese IR school people, they don't really consider my work to be part of Chinese IR, if you take the narrower definition. But I don't really pay much attention to that because I think as long as I make interesting contribution, and which may be useful to other parts of the world, I may occasionally draw from Chinese elements, but not all the time. And then, I think I'm, fairly satisfied with what I have been doing and what I will be able to do in the future.
Okay, so if we focus on the more narrow perspective, even though you have not worked within that perspective yourself necessarily, perhaps you could describe for the students what you would consider the core concepts or the core elements of Chinese IR. So that is first. And then second, you could perhaps go on and elaborate on what you have been working with.
Okay, so I think the particular thing that if you take the narrower version of the Chinese IR is you actually have to explicitly draw from, Chinese elements. Particularly, I would say, at least at the present time, professors like, Yaqing or Xuetong, they particularly like to draw from Asian Chinese practice, including philosophy, foreign affairs, some kind of thinking about, all under heavens thing. Yeah. So that's the key common property of the, narrower version of Chinese IR. I would say the debate within that particular narrow version is actually to, what specific elements they want to draw, right? So, Yaqing had a particular understanding what kind of things he thinks that are unique to Chinese understanding of the world, relations. And Yan Xuetong has a particular understanding that is he believes that is moral or kind of having a moral sense of in terms of international practice. That's the key element he wants to draw. So there are some other, less well-known elements to be drawn from Asian Chinese philosophy practice and even modern Chinese understanding. So those are the main elements within the narrow version of Chinese IR. I have never been part of that kind of intellectual enterprise. So what I do is really say, I think I actually once said it, for me, China or Chinese material or Chinese elements are really just one source of my intellectual, inspiration, data points, but it cannot be the only one. So I don't really do, strictly speaking, the narrow version of Chinese IR. So what I have been working on are more universal, I would say, such as social evolution, Kill dilemma, or regionalism that may be applicable to other parts of the world. So I have that maybe partially because I was trained as a natural scientist, and natural scientists always want to strive for more universal knowledge rather than local knowledge. Although I have great respect for local knowledge, and occasionally I also do that. But that has never been my particular interest, at least not exclusively speaking.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So while some Chinese scholars like Yan Xuetong or Yaqing, they emphasize moral leadership or relationality or relations, and perhaps even we could bring in the all under heaven concept or the Tianxia concept. You have worked with concepts that you consider are more universal. So concepts like social evolution, the security dilemma. You also wrote a fantastic piece where you criticized the agency structure debate in IR, where you developed a more holistic and better developed understanding of international system, I would say. And that actually brings me to a question in relation to a Chinese IR concept, which is Tianxia, or all under heaven, and a specific American scholar's attempt to universalize that concept. Salvatore Babones, he wrote a piece about the Tianxia concept, trying to universalize the concept in a sense of taking this local or this Chinese understanding or concept of Tianxia, or all under heaven, and trying to make it universally applicable. Are you familiar with that attempt? And is that something that is, do you think it's useful?
Daniel Bell? Were you talking about Daniel Bell?
No, I was not talking about Daniel Bell. I was talking about Salvatore Babones. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's an American sociologist.
No, I'm not really familiar with his work. So
okay.
There's so many things I have to read. I didn't really get to read them all.
But in any case, the idea here is to take this local Chinese concept and universalize it. Would you say that such attempts are useful and fruitful? Because it seems to me that you try to distinguish between a local Chinese school or local Chinese concepts and universal concepts.
Okay, so I have yet to read the book, so I cannot really elaborate what kind of things he have said. But what I would argue will be this: I think there are potentially universal elements with the all under heaven concept. It means if we consider all humanity as a one single ecosystem on Earth, there are certain elements that can be made universal from the Tianxia concept. It really depends on how you want to universalize it. So I particularly don't believe that what Zhao Tingyang had in mind was universal enough, because he was particularly demanding a certain kind of a set of moral codes rather than a particular concept, per se. So, on this particular front, I would say, I'm a fan of, for a kind of a, natural scientist turned a social scientist. I'm also particularly a fan of Foucault. So I would argue that any moral code has a strong element of, localized knowledge per se. So therefore, if you want to universalize a certain concept, you may want to be very cautious whether you want to universalize the set of moral code associated with that particular concept. So I would say, if I were Zhao Tingyang, if I were to develop a Tianxia concept, I may want to, at least minimize the weight of the moral code implicated by the all under heaven concept. That's what I would do, but I don't have time to do that.
Okay, no, but that makes a lot of sense, and thank you for that elaboration. So if we continue, we have already discussed the Chinese School of International Relations, and you have made a good distinction there as well. So I don't think I need to elaborate or ask more questions concerning that. Instead, I would like to focus on the core concepts that you have been working with. So if you can choose 2 or 3 core IR concepts or social science concepts that you have worked with, which ones would you choose and why?
Okay, so the really most important concept which I have been working on is really social evolution. So partially because of my training in biology, also geology, so I always had a sense of time, in the sense, how time is the most critical variable in driving any social change or stability. So what I was able to discover, I would say, to my surprise, when I was studying international relations theory in Berkeley, was, there was no sense of time. Well, there were a few interesting contributions, like Robert Cox, or Alex Wayne, and a few, but most of the mainstream IR scholars, at least in America, they were not really looking at the transformational power of time. So that particular realization really struck me and stayed with me for a couple of years, until finally I woke up and say, well, this must be something that I think will be very important, and perhaps, at least allow us to see international relations in an entirely different way. It's like if you compare Einstein to Newton, it's really, Einstein was able to add the dimension of time to Newton's system, you see. Mm-hmm. So I would, in a particular way, I would say in IR scholarship has really lacked the dimension of time. So from then on, I would say I have been working on the social evolution for a long time, probably more than 15, 17 years until early this year, I published my new book on social evolution. So that's the most important concept because I think it's universal, and it's very important for us to understand how IR has changed itself, transformed itself, and therefore statesmen, and also our IR scholars have to really change the way we look at international relations. The second concept, which I have been working on for a while, but I have pretty much stopped, it's really the security dilemma. It's really, I think it's a very powerful and integrative middle level concept and middle level theory. Well, by security dilemma theory, I mean, there's something which combines security dilemma with a spiral model so that you can actually explain a lot of international relations, especially state-to-state interactions. So the other side of security dilemma is, of course, what we call the de-escalation or reassurance. So therefore, to combine the security dilemma with reassurance, which really contain in my first IR book, the defensive realism one, it's really important for us to see how countries can actually escalate into war, but also can de-escalate into stable peace, cold peace, or even warm peace, such as between France and Germany is a classical case. So that's the second concept I would say I have been working quite consistently. There are 2 or 3 related concepts which are more psychological I have been working on. One is fear. You probably have read 1 or 2 pieces about that. And second is I have been working on reputation. I didn't have time to finish another pet project about reputation, but I think reputation is important because a lot of statesmen really put a lot of weight on reputation. Finally, I would say a particular psychological concept, but also with the system agent debates, really how international system or how a social system impacts agents. So, I mean, there have been much writing on the agent system debate or agent structure debate, but I would say much of the debate has been too Parsonian, so misleading, I would say incomplete. So what I would like to do is say, in order to understand the interaction between system and agent, you have to know at least 2 sides. One is how agents can shape or construct or transform system, and the other side is really how the system really impacts an agent. And so what I call the 6 dimensions, 6 channels, and then how can you impact agents' behavior, idea, through 4 internal drivers and 1 external driver. So I would say for many students, I would say they probably think when they read my stuff, they think they're all scattered around, but I don't see that. I actually do, I would say, a fairly ambitious project in the sense I want to combine the micro, the macro, and the meso through a social evolution, but also a dynamic way of looking at the international system, but also in the human society too. So I do write about sociology too. I write about sub-national conflicts such as ethnic conflict. So they are all kind of related to what I do in terms of concepts. So I use these core concepts to kind of allow me to look at the different issues and domains. And I would say this is a very useful way, at least for students or scholars who are willing to pursue a scholarly career. I would say this is a very useful way of doing things. It means you can grow a research project rather than say when you finish one article, you have to think about the next article to write. For me, the burden is always I have way too many things to write, which I will never be able to finish, I guess. But they're all connected somehow, somewhere.
Yeah, but it still emphasizes this point that I made earlier, that you're very creative, very ambitious, and intellectually audacious scholar, I would say. You are in so many different fields and you have been researching on so many different topics. So in that sense, it is perhaps very wrong. It is perhaps always wrong, but when it comes to you, it is perhaps even more wrong to try to categorize you in the sense of putting you in a particular box, higher theory.
Right.
You are a realist or a Marxist or a constructivist.
If you want to put a label, I'm a social evolutionist. So I'm not a realist, I'm not a constructivist, I'm not a neoliberalist or whatever, you know. So because social evolution allows a human agent, a system, to transform him or herself, but also itself. And therefore, so we, because, you know, humans are, you know, animals who are capable of intellectual thinking. So we can actually, you know, adapt to the environment with a purpose. It's not necessarily entirely teleological, but, you know, we have our moral purpose, we have our instrumental purpose, and therefore we can actually change what we do and how we think and what we think in terms of different environment.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We have to have another session where we focus only on social evolution, I think, in order to get that straight. Well, thank you very much for that perspective. I normally ask another question about policy relevance when I interview IR scholars, but I don't really know if it is applicable here. But in any case, we can ask it and see if it leads anywhere. In terms of policy,
I can say a few words about, you know, how Chinese IR inform policy.
How would a Chinese IR inform policy?
How would Chinese IR inform policy, or how has Chinese IR been informed policy?
Yeah, the latter perhaps.
The last one?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say every state, you know, in any modern state, you always have to rely on some kind of expertise informed policy making when you construct foreign policy or IR strategy, whatever. But I would say it's not really very clear, or it's very difficult to gauge the real impact of Chinese IR per se. So we really don't know how much impact Professor Xuetong or Yaqing has on Chinese foreign policy. Because, you know, in the Chinese system, the decision making, but even in some other political system, most IR decision making are very centralized system. So it's, I would argue, like any other state, if there is any, you know, concrete impact, most of the time it's really informal, indirect. So there are only a few occasions, I would say, you know, particular Chinese IR scholar or particular Chinese way of thinking about IR may have, you know, particular concrete impact on particular Chinese policy.
Okay, yeah. Maybe IR scholars do not have so much influence. Maybe we should go to Professor Justin Lin instead. Justin Yifu Lin, maybe he has more influence in terms of...
Yes, I know him well.
Yeah, okay. So then you might know if he has influence or not.
Right. Oh, he was a belief in Keynes, that is, you know, the really ideas, really, eventually, what counts really are ideas. So I hope, right?
yeah, he has been influential in terms of his new structural economics, I would say, not just in China, but also in Ethiopia.
Yes, he's one of the few Chinese scholars, social scientists, who had at least have an ambition to construct a more universal kind of knowledge kind of framework.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so last question before we leave. Any advice to the IR students at Malmö University?
I won't call it my advice. I would say, you know, from my kind of experience, I would say there are three things we should do if you want to become a scholar, whether in IR or some other social science or even natural science. The first thing is really you have to care about the real world. I mean, you have to care about humanity. You have to care about human welfare. And therefore, because that's really ultimately drives our work. Because if you don't care about the real world, you lose your, not just particular interest, but also, I mean, the stamina to sustain your energy in terms of pursuing knowledge. Right? The second, I would say, is really you know, people like, you know, Bob Jervis or, you know, LeBeau or, you know, Cohen or, you know, these kind of a giant, I would say they have a very wide knowledge base, which I think are really essential for any sustained contribution to IR or any other scholarship, in which I think I partially possess, because I read widely. I don't just read IR stuff, I read many other stuff. Finally, I would say it's really, you know, when you start young, when you start, you know, as a graduate student, you don't want to, you know, put too much into your dissertation. I think it's should be a manageable project, because I think I can tell some of my students, my own students, because they probably look at what I have been doing and they want to, you know, do one big thing at one time, which I don't think is really wise road. So because I also started with a fairly, you know, middle level theory and gradually moved to more ambitious projects. So I think it's important for us to know our limit in terms of the time and also in terms of knowledge, because when you are young, there is no way you can know so many things as, you know, people like Bob Jervis who are much older than we are. So I think that those are the three things which I think should be useful for any student who wants to pursue, you know, just not IR, but, you know, any scholarly enterprise.
Okay, thank you very much for that useful advice.
Okay.
And thank you very much for participating in this interview series.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. And I hope to see you in person someday.
Yeah, I hope so too. All the very best.
Okay.